"A woman like you does not belong here." The words weren't a whisper. They were spoken clearly and sharply, like an ice-cold dagger severing the gentle violin music and the feigned laughter in the opulent hall of the De Winter mansion. For a moment, hundreds of pairs of eyes froze in unison, crystal glasses in hand suspended mid-air, all attention fixed on the epicenter of the impending chaos. And there, in the eye of the storm, was Seraphina Vance. She sat there, back straight, chin slightly raised, a fortress of calm and power, standing out in a sea of old money, white elites. The burnt orange silk dress she wore was as vibrant as a sunset flame, a defiant declaration against the cold, safe tones of the black tuxedos and pale pastel gowns around her. Seraphina was the founder and CEO of Nexus Dynamics, a tech powerhouse that had rewritten the rules of Silicon Valley. She was the embodiment of intellect, of rising from nothing, and in this room, her brown skin made her a presence that was both admired and scrutinized to the last detail. The one who had just uttered the slur, Scarlett De Winter, glided forward like a proud but venomous swan. Her fiery red hair was perfectly coiled into a bun, revealing a slender neck and sparkling diamond earrings. Her icy blue evening gown clung to her body, and her green eyes, her most beautiful weapon, now gleamed with undisguised contempt. Scarlett was the De Winter family's jewel, the spoiled younger sister of Alistair De Winter, CEO of Evergreen Holdings, the corporation with which Seraphina had just finalized a $9.5 billion merger deal this morning. This party, in theory, was for celebration, but Seraphina knew its true nature. This was not a partnership, but a rescue. Evergreen Holdings, an aging empire built on legacy and connections, could not withstand the ruthless innovation of Nexus Dynamics. Merger was merely a polite term for surrender, and Scarlett, a person who had known only privilege her entire life, could not swallow the fact that her family had to bow to a black woman she considered an outsider. Seraphina slowly placed her glass of water on the table, the sound so soft it was almost inaudible. But in the room's sudden silence, it resonated like thunder. She looked up at Scarlett, her dark eyes calm and deep. "I apologize," Seraphina said, her voice low and smooth as velvet, without a single ripple. "I don't think I heard you correctly. Would you mind repeating that?" Seraphina's composure seemed only to add fuel to Scarlett's rage. She curled her lip into an ugly, distorted smile on her beautiful face. "Oh, I think you heard me just fine." Scarlett emphasized each word, her voice sickeningly sweet, loud enough for everyone around to hear. "I said, a woman like you does not belong here. You can buy a company, but you can't buy class. You can't buy lineage, and you certainly can't buy our centuries of history." Alistair, who had been talking a few feet away, paled. He quickly pushed through the crowd. "Scarlett, that's enough. What the hell are you doing? She's my guest." "Guest?" Scarlett laughed, a high-pitched, cutting sound. "You call this a guest, Alistair, or an invader who has driven us into a corner?" She turned away, ignoring her brother, her eyes locked back onto Seraphina. Or perhaps we should call it what it really is, a lucky streak. And then, before Alistair could intervene, Scarlett acted. With a dramatic and cruel flourish, she swung her hand, flinging the half-empty glass of red wine straight at Seraphina. The dark red liquid flew in a perfect arc through the air before splashing across the chest and body of Seraphina's dress. It spread over the orange silk, turning the vibrant sunset flame into a splotchy, blood-like stain. A few drops spattered onto the pristine white tablecloth and dripped onto the polished marble floor. A collective "oh" escaped from the guests. A few women covered their mouths with their hands. Some men frowned in displeasure, but no one said a word. They just watched, as if observing a tragic play. Seraphina remained still. She could feel the cold, sticky wine seeping through the fabric, onto her skin. The strong smell of alcohol and fruit filled her nostrils, but her face was a mask of absolute serenity. Her eyes didn't even blink. Inside, her mind was working at the speed of a supercomputer. There it is, she thought. The bait is taken. The play has begun. Show me all your ugliness. Seraphina's silence was a challenge Scarlett could not bear. What's wrong? Are you too shocked to speak? Scarlett snarled, taking a step closer, invading Seraphina's personal space. In an even more vulgar act, she brazenly dipped her index finger into the wine stain on Seraphina's dress, then streaked it across her cheek. See? This color suits you. It looks so wild. This time, even the most seasoned guests gasped in horror. This was no longer an accident, but a deliberate attack, a raw and public humiliation. Alistair finally grabbed his sister's arm. "Scarlett, stop it now." But it was too late. The racist rage had turned Scarlett into a deranged animal. She tore her arm away from her brother, and in a final, frenzied impulse, grabbed a handful of the expensive silk fabric on Seraphina's shoulder and pulled with all her might. Reap! The dry, cruel sound of tearing fabric cut through the music. One side of Seraphina's dress was ripped open, revealing her delicate collarbone and smooth brown skin. Now, she was not only stained, but also shamefully exposed before hundreds of eyes. A heavy silence fell over the room. In a corner, Lord Caspian Blackwood, a silver-haired veteran investor, shook his head in disgust, not out of pity for Seraphina, but for the De Winter family's irredeemable foolishness. Whispers began to rise. "My God, that's Seraphina Vance, the partner in the $9 billion deal." Scarlett heard and sneered, her face flushed with triumph. "Do you hear that?" she said loudly, her voice full of smugness. "All the money in the world can't buy you lineage. Now, get on your knees and apologize, and maybe my brother will be merciful enough to forgive your insolence." But Seraphina did not look at Scarlett. She did not look at a stunned Alistair or the murmuring crowd. Her eyes, for the first time all evening, briefly glanced down at the smartwatch on her wrist. The screen remained dark. She was still waiting. Her silence was not submission, but the patience of a master hunter, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And then, it came. An extremely faint vibration, almost imperceptible, traveled from the watch up her wrist. The dark screen suddenly flashed a tiny green checkmark, glowing brightly for a millisecond before fading. "Received. Plan is complete." A smile, almost invisible, curled on one side of Seraphina's lips. It held no warmth, only the coldness of ice and the sharpness of a newly honed blade. Scarlett's pathetic little play had unintentionally become the signal she was waiting for, the signal for her to not only end this performance, but to burn the entire stage down. The storm of humiliation had reached its peak. Now, it was time for the earthquake to begin. Just as Seraphina's icy smile faded, a shrill sound tore through the thick air of the hall. It was Alistair De Winter's phone, ringing madly and discordantly, like a fire alarm in a silent theatre. All eyes turned to him. Alistair looked flustered, like a caught criminal, fumbling to pull the phone from his pocket, his face contorted in annoyance at being interrupted at the worst possible moment. But when he saw the name Marcus Thorne, CFO, flashing on the screen, Alistair's irritation immediately turned into a vague unease. Marcus was a cautious man. He would never call at this hour unless something was truly serious. "Hello, Marcus. What the hell do you want, calling me at this hour?" Alistair snapped, turning his back to the crowd, trying to find some fleeting privacy. But in the room's near absolute silence, the panicked, fragmented voice of the chief financial officer from the other end of the line was still audible, even if the words were indistinct. People might not have heard every word, but they could sense the panic in his tone. Alistair's confidence began to crack, his forehead beaded with sweat, his eyes widened. "Slow down, Marcus. Speak slowly. What are you talking about?" He listened for a few seconds, and then his entire world seemed to collapse. "What?" Alistair's scream echoed, his voice raw with horror and disbelief. It was no longer the voice of a powerful CEO, but the cry of a wounded animal. "Hostile takeover? That's impossible. Our stock. It's been acquired. By who? Who has the means to do that without us knowing? What vote? Are you insane, Marcus? No way. Alistair's face went white as a shroud. He staggered, one hand grabbing the back of a nearby chair to keep from falling. He turned around, slowly like a broken automaton, his eyes wild with a desperate need for an explanation. And then, his gaze locked onto the woman standing there, frighteningly calm, with her torn dress and a smear of wine on her cheek. Her mysterious smile from moments before now appeared in his mind like a malicious prophecy. "You witch," he whispered, his throat dry. Then fear turned to fury, and he roared, pointing at Seraphina. "You! What did you do? What the hell did you do?" If before, the eyes on Seraphina were filled with curiosity and pity, now they held a mixture of awe, shock, and a vague terror. She was no longer a victim. She was the epicenter of the earthquake. Seraphina slowly and deliberately rose to her feet. Every movement exuded absolute control. Her dress was ripped on one side, the wine stain a dark red scar, but her posture was regal, as straight as a warrior queen fresh from the battlefield. She looked directly at Alistair, then her eyes swept over Scarlet, who was now as pale as a ghost. Finally, she surveyed the breathless room. Her voice, not loud but carrying in strange gravitas, filled every corner of the hall, silencing every whisper. "Your brother's right, Scarlet," Seraphina replied, her voice icy. "I am a witch." A deadly silence fell. Even the orchestra had stopped playing, unnoticed. I can turn a $9.5 billion merger deal into the most elaborate play the financial world has ever seen. A perfect play. She paused, letting her words sink deep into everyone's mind, to lull you all to sleep. She took a step forward, the sound of her heels on the marble floor like a judge's gavel about to pass sentence. "While you were busy celebrating, toasting to the rescue of your rotting legacy," she said, her eyes razor-sharp, "my team at Nexus Dynamics, the people you've always looked down on as newcomers, quietly completed the final phase of a plan months in the making, acquiring all the floating shares of Evergreen Holdings on the open market, through dozens of shell companies and investment funds." A gasp of horror rippled through the crowd. Alistair looked as if he had been struck by lightning. But that's impossible," he stammered, his mind desperately clinging to the rules he had always known. "A takeover vote requires board approval, a pre-announcement. The CEO has to agree." Seraphina smiled, a cold and omnipotent smile. "Oh, that's the best part of the play, Alistair. Do you remember that thick merger contract your legal team skimmed this morning? You were so busy with the $9.5 billion, so eager to get the money, that you forgot to read the fine print." She raised a slender finger. "Specifically, Appendix D, Section 3, Clause 11B, a tiny clause, hidden deep within hundreds of pages of boring legal text." She paused, letting the tension build to its peak. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the final blow. "We call it the Trojan Horse Clause. Catchy name, isn't it? It stipulates that if the buyer, Nexus Dynamics, discovers evidence of a lack of transparency in internal management culture, a very vague and interpretable phrase, wouldn't you agree, we have the full right to convene an emergency shareholder vote, which would take place immediately via a secure digital platform. That vote would override the veto power of the current CEO and board of directors. And that evidence?" She glanced at Scarlet. "Your sister's performance tonight, clearly recorded by at least 30 phones in this room, was more than enough. And that vote," she continued, her voice even as a verdict, "concluded exactly 5 minutes ago." She held up her smartwatch. The screen was still dark, but to the people in the room, it held the destructive power of a nuclear bomb. The green signal I just received was the final result. Approval rating, 51.7%. She looked straight into the stunned eyes of the two De Winter siblings. Her voice was as cold as steel, decisive and unshakable. "I didn't come here to sign a merger contract, Alistair. I came here to announce that I just bought Evergreen Holdings, your family's entire empire." The entire hall seemed to stop breathing. Time stood still. You could hear a single drop of wine fall from Seraphina's dress to the floor. Seraphina smiled, the smile of an absolute victor. "Welcome to your first day of working under me." She turned to Scarlet, who was trembling, her face as white as a ghost. Seraphina spoke each word distinctly, her tone calm, but carrying the cruelty of an executioner. "And as the new owner, my first decision is to fire you. Immediately. Security will escort you out." She stared deep into Scarlet's eyes, using her own words to deliver the final blow. "Because you no longer belong here." The phrase landed like a hammer. Scarlet staggered, as if hit by an invisible punch. Two security guards in black suits, who just minutes before had obeyed her orders, now approached her politely but firmly, escorting her away in ultimate humiliation. Alistair, completely broken, slumped into a nearby chair. He looked at Seraphina, no longer with anger, but with a terrifying emptiness. His voice was a hollow whisper. "Since when? This plan, when did you start it?" Seraphina looked at him, her eyes devoid of pity, holding only the coldness of reality. Her answer encapsulated the entire story of arrogance, misjudgment, and the price to be paid. "Since the first day you underestimated me." The grand oak door of the hall slammed shut behind the De Winter siblings, its dry sound a final period on a dynasty. Scarlet was led away in silent disgrace, and Alistair staggered after her, a king who had lost his throne in the blink of an eye. The atmosphere of the party was dead. The music had stopped. Conversations had fizzled out, but no one dared to leave their place. They stood there, stunned, like statues in a museum that had just witnessed a living work of art swallow the artist who created it. All eyes were on Seraphina Vance. She still stood in the center of the room, a burnt orange flame in a forest of ashes. The rip on her shoulder was no longer a sign of humiliation, but a trophy, a proud scar of a warrior. A young server, her face still pale with fright, timidly approached. The girl held a cream-colored cashmere shawl in her hands, her voice trembling. "Mrs. Vance, would you like to use this to cover yourself?" The small act was a ripple of humanity in a frozen sea of shock. Seraphina turned, and for the first time since the drama began, the steel in her eyes softened. She looked at the server, a gentle, almost warm smile gracing her lips. "Thank you for your kindness," she said, her voice mellow. "But it won't be necessary." She refused the shawl decisively but politely. To cover the tear now would be a sign of weakness, and Seraphina was not weak. She wanted everyone here, the heirs, the tycoons, the people who always judged others based on lineage and skin color, to look directly at it. She wanted them to see the splotchy wine stain like a smear of blood. She wanted them to etch this image into their minds, the image of a woman attacked, humiliated, but not broken. Instead, she had absorbed all that venom and turned it into fuel to ignite a revolution. This scar was not proof of injury, but a monument to the enemy's arrogance and ignorance. In a corner of the room, Lord Caspian Blackwood, the veteran investor with silver hair and sharp eyes, who had witnessed countless upheavals in the financial world, gave Seraphina a slight nod. A discreet nod, but in the world of power and unwritten rules, it carried the weight of an oath of allegiance. It was recognition from a power of the old world, an old lion acknowledging the dominance of a new queen. He understood that tonight a new order had been established. Seraphina gestured to another server, who stood frozen with a tray of drinks in hand. "A glass of Merlot, please," she requested calmly. It was the same type of wine Scarlet had thrown at her. The server hurriedly gave her a fresh glass, his hands shaking so much he almost spilled it. She took the glass, the dark red liquid shimmering under the magnificent chandelier, looking exactly like the stain on her dress. But she did not drink. She raised it like a general raising a sword after battle. Her eyes swept across every stunned face in the hall. "Tonight," she began, her voice clear, resonant, and sharp. They tried to strip me of my dignity. They used humiliation to remind me that I do not belong here. She paused for a beat, letting her words sink deep into the silence. Her hand holding the glass tightened. They failed miserably. Instead of destroying me, they only left a tear. Her eyes looked down at the rip on her shoulder, a look not of pain, but of contemplation. Then she looked up, and her eyes burned with fierce determination, a vision that went far beyond personal revenge. And tonight, right here, I have decided to turn this tear into a symbol. No, more than that. I will turn it into a legacy. She took a deep breath, preparing for the declaration that would reshape not only her future, but that of countless others. I officially announced the establishment of the Crimson Sovereign Fund. The name sounded like a tragic and powerful poem. Crimson, the red of wine, the color of humiliation, but also the color of royalty, of ultimate power. Sovereign affirming the status she had just seized. This fund, she continued, will be entirely financed by the profits of Evergreen Holdings. No, I apologize. She corrected herself with finality, as if hammering the last nail into the old dynasty's coffin. From now on, it will be Evergreen Dynamics. And its mission is simple, to mend the tears that this society has deliberately caused. It will invest in women of color entrepreneurs, in startups from minority communities, in brilliant minds who have always been told they do not belong here just because of their background, skin color, or gender. This announcement was even more shocking than the spectacular takeover. The entire hall was stunned. Seraphina had not just defeated her enemy, she was confiscating their assets and using them to build an army of people just like her, to ensure no one would ever have to endure what she had just experienced. This was not revenge. This was a large-scale redistribution of power. Instead of raising a toast, Seraphina did something no one could have expected. She slowly bent down, tilted the glass of wine, and poured the entire dark red liquid onto the marble floor, right where Scarlet had stood when she threw the wine at her. The wine flowed out, red as blood, like a cleansing ritual, washing away the defilement. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice mellow but full of authority, purified from the old stains. Then she placed the empty glass on a nearby table, the sound of crystal on wood sharp and final. She turned, looking at no one, and walked away. She didn't head for the exit, but for the grand, winding marble staircase leading to the private quarters of the mansion. This mansion, the symbol of De Winter power, was now hers as well. She was ascending to claim her kingdom. And then, a strange thing happened. As she took her first step onto the stairs, the entire hall rose to their feet, in unison. No applause rang out. Applause seemed too trivial, too small for this historical moment. Instead, there was an overwhelming silence, a silence filled with respect, fear, and a belated understanding. Seraphina Vance had not just won a battle, she had won a war. She had proven that true power is not about destroying your enemies, but about turning their ashes into the foundation for a greater, more humane legacy. And the rip on her dress, under the magnificent crystal chandelier, did not look like an injury. It looked like a bolt of lightning, etching the mark of a newly crowned empress. 2 years later, entering the main hall of the Evergreen Dynamics building now felt like stepping into another world. The gloomy, oppressive atmosphere of the old regime had been completely scrubbed away, replaced by a space flooded with light and energy. The dark oak walls were replaced with floor-to-ceiling glass, revealing a vibrant cityscape. Where there were once oil portraits of generations of De Winters, there were now colorful contemporary art pieces by artists of color and minority communities. The air was no longer thick with the scent of privilege, but alive with the sound of laughter and a dozen different languages. Seraphina hadn't just bought a company, she had performed a soul transplant on it. Evergreen Dynamics had risen to become a global model, not only for its soaring profits but also for its progressive corporate culture. Meanwhile, the Crimson Sovereign Fund had become a powerhouse in the investment world. In just 2 years, the fund had launched hundreds of careers, injecting capital into founders who previously would never have had a chance to get through the doors of traditional investors. They were the tiers that were slowly weaving the fabric of the future. And at the heart of all that change, in the very center of the hall, was a silent vow. Inside a softly lit block of tempered glass, the burnt orange silk dress was displayed like a national treasure. It immortalized the moment this new empire was born. The dark red wine stain remained, unfaded, like a royal seal bestowed in fire. And the tear on the shoulder, unsewn, was proud and defiant. It had become the company's moral compass. Every new employee heard the story behind it. Every major decision was made under its invisible watch. A young woman named Maya stood before the dress, her eyes shining with admiration. She was a brilliant software engineer who had just been promoted, a prime example of the Seraphina Vance era, someone hired for her talent, not her family name. To Maya, the dress was not just a relic, it was a sacred artifact. It still has power, doesn't it? The familiar, deep voice beside her made Maya jump. She turned and saw Seraphina Vance herself standing there, smiling at her. 5 years had passed, and she looked even more astute, still in a perfectly tailored suit. But her eyes now held not only determination but also the contentment of a creator. "Mrs. Vance," Maya exclaimed, trying to remain composed. I didn't mean to intrude. I was just." "It's all right," Seraphina said, her eyes warm. "I come down here often, so I never forget." Maya took a breath, gathering her courage. "Ma'am, is it true? That night, when everything happened, you weren't afraid at all?" Seraphina looked at the dress, her gaze distant. "Who told you I wasn't afraid?" she replied, surprising Maya. "I was afraid. I was angry. I felt humiliated. I am human." For a moment, I heard their voices in my head. "You don't belong here. You are a fraud. A single tear and you'll fall apart." She turned to look directly into Maya's eyes, a look that transmitted strength. "But what people like them will never understand is that people like us have lived our whole lives with tears. We are born from them. We grow with them. One more tear doesn't break us. It only reminds us that we are still alive, still fighting." She stepped closer, her voice lowered, full of intimacy. "And there's one thing I learned from that night, Maya, one thing I want you to always remember. Never let anyone in this world convince you that a scar is a weakness. Never be ashamed of your wounds." She smiled, a radiant smile, full of wisdom and triumph, because sometimes a tear isn't an end. Sometimes it's where the light can get in. Maya felt a jolt run down her spine. It was not just a story. It was a lesson, an empowerment. She looked back at the dress, and for the first time, she saw it completely. It was not just a symbol of a past victory, but a promise of countless future victories. Seraphina Vance's true legacy was not just measured in stock value or skyscrapers. Her legacy was standing right in front of her, in the form of a talented young engineer, and in the hundreds of others like her, who every day walked into this building with their heads held high, knowing that they not only belonged here, but they were the ones building it. The Empress's legacy was a living truth. The greatest kingdom is not built with